heavy oak door slammed with a deafening thud, sending a violent shudder through the peeling wallpaper of the cramped suburban hallway. The sound marked the definitive end of a marriage that had been dying a slow, agonizing death for years. Sarah was now entirely alone, standing in the wreckage of her life with 3 young children depending on her for their very survival. The promise of a happily ever after had evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of unpaid bills, broken promises, and the terrifying prospect of raising a family single-handedly. But in the darkest moments of our lives, when we feel completely abandoned and stripped of all hope, destiny has a strange way of intervening. Sometimes, the most extraordinary miracles arrive disguised as our deepest burdens. This is a story about the devastating pain of betrayal, the forgotten dreams we bury deep inside our souls, and a miraculous, unexpected encounter that proved that true family isn't always defined by blood. Sarah's life had never been a fairy tale. Having spent her formative years bouncing through the unforgiving foster care system of the Midwest, she had learned early on that nothing was permanent. After her only prospective adoptive family abandoned her to move overseas, a young Sarah had retreated into a world of absolute silence. She communicated only through her art, drawing hauntingly beautiful emotional sketches that stunned her teachers, but survival took precedence over passion. Shortly after aging out of the system, she met Mark. He was older, charming, and offered the one thing Sarah craved above all else, a sense of belonging. They married, bought a cheap decaying farmhouse on the outskirts of a small Indiana town, and had 3 children, Noah, Leo, and little Mia. But Mark's true nature soon revealed itself. He was profoundly lazy, selfish, and deeply resentful of the financial burden his own children presented. He refused to hold down a steady job, forcing Sarah to work grueling double shifts, cleaning office buildings and working at the local dairy plant just to keep the lights on. Over the past year, Mark had grown completely distant, treating his family like an inconvenient roommate situation. The love had rotted away, leaving only resentment. The breaking point was imminent, and when it finally arrived, it brought an explosive confrontation that would force Sarah to rebuild her entire existence from the ground up. Sarah stood frozen in the dim light of the living room, her trembling fingers gripping the shredded nylon of a winter jacket. Her eldest son, Noah, stood pressed against the faded floral wall, his eyes fixed firmly on the scuffed linoleum. The jacket was ruined, a jagged tear running down the entire left sleeve. In a household where every single dollar was counted and stretched until it snapped, this was an absolute catastrophe. Her husband, Mark, walked in from the kitchen, his heavy work boots thudding against the floorboards. He didn't look at Noah's terrified face. He didn't look at the ruined jacket. Instead, his gaze swept over the messy living room with absolute disdain. A suffocating silence filled the space, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of the leaky kitchen faucet. Mark let out a harsh, theatrical sigh, running a hand through his thinning hair. The torn jacket wasn't the real problem. It was just the spark that was about to ignite the powder keg of their crumbling marriage. The air grew impossibly cold as Mark walked toward the bedroom, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. Sarah knew exactly what was coming. The tension was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. When Mark emerged from the bedroom, he was dragging a large, battered suitcase behind him. The metallic squeak of the wheels against the wooden floor sounded like a scream in the quiet house. Noah, Leo, and little Mia sat huddled on the worn fabric of the sofa, watching their father with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Mark didn't offer a word of comfort. He didn't kneel down to hug them. He just stood by the front door, adjusting the collar of his coat. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," he muttered, not even making eye contact with her. "I'm tired of working my fingers to the bone for a family that just drains me. I deserve to be happy." Sarah felt a hot flash of pure anger cut through her despair. "Working!" she scoffed, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I work 2 jobs to put food on this table while you complain about the cost of your children's winter clothes." Mark simply rolled his eyes, a gesture of profound disrespect. He pulled open the front door, the cold evening wind sweeping into the hallway. Without another word, he stepped out onto the porch, leaving his family behind as easily as one discards an old newspaper. The heavy door clicked shut, finalizing the abandonment. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah leaned against the hallway wall, slowly sliding down until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her hands. The tears came hot and fast, fueled by exhaustion, fear, and a terrifying sense of isolation. How was she going to pay the mortgage? How would she feed the kids? Little Mia slipped off the sofa and padded softly across the floor, her small arms wrapping around Sarah's neck. "Is Daddy coming back?" she whispered, her voice fragile. Sarah looked up, wiping the tears from her red, swollen eyes. She forced a brave, wavering smile for her daughter. "We're going to be just fine, sweetie," she lied, hoping the sheer willpower of her words would make them true. She gathered all three children into a tight embrace, inhaling the scent of their cheap shampoo. In that quiet, heartbreaking moment on the hallway floor, a profound shift occurred within Sarah. The weeping stopped. A hardened resolve took root in her chest. Mark was gone, and he wasn't coming back to save them. She was the only shield standing between her children and the harsh reality of the world. She had to be strong. The next morning brought a blindingly bright suburban sunrise, mocking the darkness inside Sarah's heart. The news of Mark's departure had spread through the small community like wildfire. By noon, the heavy rumble of a pickup truck sounded in the driveway. It was Chloe, Sarah's fiercely loyal best friend who worked double shifts at the local diner. Chloe burst through the front door like a hurricane, carrying a large cardboard tray of coffees and a box of glazed donuts. "I heard that worthless piece of garbage finally packed his bags," Chloe announced, slamming the coffee onto the kitchen counter. Sarah offered a weak, exhausted smile. "News travels fast," she murmured, wrapping her cold hands around a steaming paper cup. Chloe pulled Sarah into a bone-crushing hug, smelling faintly of vanilla and fried food. "Listen to me," Chloe said fiercely, gripping Sarah's shoulders. "You are not going to cry over a man who contributed absolutely nothing to this house. He was your fourth child, Sarah. You're going to realize very soon that your life just got a whole lot easier." Chloe's blunt, unapologetic honesty was exactly the anchor Sarah needed to stop floating away in her own anxiety. Empowered by Chloe's fiery pep talk, Sarah spent the entire weekend completely rearranging the house. It was a therapeutic purge. She dragged Mark's old broken recliner out to the curb. She scrubbed the floors with pine-scented cleaner until the whole house smelled fresh and new. She moved Mia's little bed into her own spacious room, giving the boys the larger bedroom to share. The physical labour was exhausting, but it felt incredibly cleansing. Meatball, the family's morbidly obese orange tabby cat, watched the chaotic transformation from his perch on the kitchen windowsill, occasionally meowing his approval. By Sunday evening, the house felt entirely different. The oppressive, gloomy atmosphere Mark always carried with him was completely gone. The air felt lighter, more breathable. For dinner, Sarah used the last of her emergency cash to buy a massive pepperoni pizza. The children sat around the coffee table, laughing at a cartoon on the ancient television, their faces smeared with tomato sauce. Sarah leaned back against the freshly cleaned sofa, taking a deep breath. Chloe was right. The dead weight was gone. They were going to survive this, and maybe, just maybe, they would thrive. A few weeks later, the crisp autumn air had settled over the town. Sarah had just received her paycheck from the dairy plant and decided to treat the kids to a proper grocery run. They were walking down the aisles of the local supermarket, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Noah and Leo were arguing over which brand of cereal to buy, while Mia sat in the shopping cart clutching a cheap plastic doll. As they turned the corner into the produce section, Sarah froze. Standing by the apples was Mark, and he wasn't alone. Clinging tightly to his arm was Tiffany, a woman from town known for her expensive acrylic nails and endless supply of local gossip. Mark looked up and the colour drained from his face. Tiffany, however, puffed out her chest, her eyes narrowing as she looked Sarah up and down. "Well, if it isn't the exhausted ex-wife," Tiffany sneered, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. Sarah felt a protective surge of adrenaline rush through her veins. She instinctively stepped in front of her children, shielding them from the toxic energy radiating from their father. "Hello, Mark," Sarah said calmly, her voice cold as ice. "I see you found someone with standards as low as your work ethic." Mark shifted uncomfortably, avoiding in the eyes of his children. Tiffany's face turned a violent shade of red. "You listen here," Tiffany snapped, pointing a manicured finger at Sarah. "Mark told me everything. He told me how you used him for his money and how he graciously left you the house to cover his child support. Don't expect another dime from us." Sarah actually laughed out loud. The sheer absurdity of the lie echoed through the quiet grocery aisle. "His money?" Sarah wiped a tear of genuine amusement from her eye. "Tiffany, honey, I paid the mortgage. I bought the groceries. The only thing Mark contributed to our household was dirty laundry and unpaid electric bills. And as for the child support, my lawyer filed the paperwork on Tuesday. They'll be garnishing whatever minimum wage paycheck he manages to scrap together by the end of the month." Mark's eyes widened in sheer panic. He hadn't expected Sarah to actually fight back legally. Without waiting for a response, Sarah grabbed the shopping cart and pushed past them, her head held high. For the first time in 10 years, she felt a profound sense of absolute power. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a mother protecting her territory. To celebrate her newfound independence, Sarah decided to host a small backyard cookout. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The smell of burning charcoal and grilling burgers drifted through the neighborhood. Chloe arrived, bringing a massive bowl of potato salad and a surprising +1. Walking beside her was Liam, a tall, broad-shouldered deputy from the local sheriff's department. Liam had a warm, easygoing smile and a calm demeanor that instantly made the children feel at ease. "I hope you don't mind," Chloe whispered to Sarah, blushing furiously as Liam went to help Noah flip the burgers. "We've been seeing each other for a few weeks. He's a really good guy, Sarah." Sarah beamed at her friend, genuinely thrilled to see Chloe so happy. The evening was perfect. They sat around the rusted fire pit on cheap plastic lawn chairs, sharing stories and laughing until their stomachs ached. The kids ran through the grass, chasing fireflies with empty glass jars. For a few fleeting hours, the financial stress and the lingering pain of the divorce were completely forgotten. It felt like the beginning of a beautiful new chapter in their lives. As the night wore on and the guests finally went home, Sarah stayed outside to clean up the patio. The neighborhood was completely silent, bathed in the pale, ethereal glow of a full moon. A sudden rustling sound near the wooden privacy fence caught her attention. She froze, the trash bag slipping from her fingers. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly in the cool night air. There was a low, painful groan from the shadows. Sarah grabbed a heavy flashlight from the porch and cautiously approached the fence. The beam of light pierced the darkness, revealing a horrific sight. Huddled in the dirt, shivering violently, was an elderly woman. Her clothes were torn and caked in thick mud. Her silver hair was matted with dried blood from a nasty gash on her forehead. But it was her feet that made Sarah gasp in horror. She wore no shoes, and her soles were blistered, raw, and bleeding profusely, as if she had walked for hundreds of miles on broken glass. The woman raised a trembling hand to shield her eyes from the light. "Please," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know where I am. I can't remember my name. Please help me." Every survival instinct screaming in Sarah's brain told her to call the police and walk away. But looking into the terrified, disoriented eyes of the older woman, Sarah's heart broke. She remembered the cold, clinical indifference of the foster care system, the feeling of being unwanted and tossed aside. She couldn't do that to a fellow human being. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, turning off the blinding flashlight and dropping to her knees in the dirt. "You're safe now. Let's get you inside." With immense effort, Sarah helped the woman to her feet, supporting most of her frail weight as they slowly limped toward the glowing back door of the house. Once inside, Sarah guided her to the bathroom. She drew a warm bath, adding soothing Epsom salts. She gently helped the woman peel off her ruined, filthy clothes and carefully washed the dirt and dried blood from her fragile skin. As she cleaned the terrifying wounds on the woman's feet, wrapping them in clean white gauze and antibacterial ointment, Sarah realized that despite the dirt, the woman had an undeniable aura of refinement. Her hands, though bruised, were delicate with perfectly shaped cuticles. She was clearly not a lifelong drifter. The next morning, the bright sunlight streamed through the living room windows. The woman, whom Sarah had decided to call Eleanor until they could figure out her real name, was asleep on the pull-out sofa, buried under a mountain of thick quilts. Noah, Leo, and Mia stood in a semicircle around the sofa, staring at the strange guest with intense, wide-eyed curiosity. Eleanor slowly opened her eyes, momentarily panicked, before realizing where she was. She offered the children a weak, trembling smile. "Good morning, little ones," she whispered. Mia, without a single ounce of hesitation, walked forward and placed her favourite stuffed bunny on Eleanor's chest. "My mommy fixes everything," the little girl announced proudly. "She fixed your feet, so now you have to stay." Eleanor's eyes welled up with heavy tears. Sarah walked into the room, carrying a tray of hot oatmeal and Earl Grey tea. "Give her some space, guys," Sarah scolded gently, shooing the children toward the kitchen. She set the tray down on the coffee table. "How are you feeling, Eleanor? Any memories coming back?" Eleanor shook her head, a deep sadness in her eyes. "Nothing. Just a terrible, terrifying blankness. It's like my entire life was erased overnight." Despite her severe amnesia, Eleanor integrated into the household with surprising speed and grace. She was fiercely determined not to be a burden. Unable to walk properly due to her injured feet, she took over the intellectual tasks of the house. One evening, Sarah returned exhausted from the dairy plant to find Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table with Noah. Noah, who had been failing 4th grade math miserably, was actually laughing. Eleanor was patiently explaining complex fractions using slices of an apple. She spoke with a calm, articulate, and highly educated cadence that immediately commanded respect. "You see, darling," Eleanor said softly, "math is just a puzzle, and you're a very smart boy who knows how to solve puzzles." Sarah watched from the doorway, completely stunned. Mark had always yelled at Noah when he didn't understand his homework, calling him stupid. Under Eleanor's gentle, sophisticated guidance, Noah's grades skyrocketed within weeks. Eleanor began reading classic literature to the children before bed, weaving enchanting stories that expanded their vocabularies. It became glaringly obvious to Sarah that Eleanor was a woman of significant wealth, education, and social standing. One Sunday afternoon, while the children were playing in the backyard, Eleanor approached Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "Sarah, my dear," she began, tentatively, "you spend every waking moment caring for those beautiful children and working yourself to the bone. When was the last time you did something entirely for yourself?" Sarah laughed bitterly, running a hand through her long, unkempt hair. "I think that was about a decade ago," she replied. Eleanor smiled gently and pointed to Sarah's hair. "I might not remember my name, but my hands remember a few skills. I know exactly how to cut and colour hair. Let me give you a makeover." "Please, it's the least I can do." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. They bought a cheap box of chestnut brown hair dye from the local drugstore. For 2 hours, Eleanor worked with a pair of standard kitchen scissors, snipping and layering with the confident, precise movements of a seasoned professional. When Sarah finally looked in the hazy bathroom mirror, she gasped aloud. The exhausted, frumpy housewife was gone. In her place was a stunning, vibrant woman with sophisticated shoulder-length hair that framed her bright, expressive eyes perfectly. She looked unrecognizable. That evening, Chloe came over for dinner, bursting through the door with her usual chaotic energy. She stopped dead in her tracks, her jaw dropping open as she stared at Sarah. "Oh, my dear God!" Chloe screamed, dropping her purse on the floor. "You look like a Hollywood movie star. Who did this?" Eleanor smiled modestly from her spot on the sofa. "Just a little trim," the older woman said gracefully. Deputy Liam walked in right behind Chloe, offering a polite nod. When he saw Eleanor, his professional instincts immediately kicked in. He sat down next to her on the sofa, pulling a small notebook from his uniform pocket. "Ma'am, Chloe told me about your situation. If you'll allow me, I'd like to take a clear photograph of your face and run it through the National Missing Persons database. I can also take your fingerprints. We might be able to find your family." Eleanor's hands began to tremble violently. The thought of discovering her true identity was both thrilling and utterly terrifying. "Yes, please, officer," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. Liam gently took her photo with his smartphone and rolled her ink-stained fingers onto a small card. The waiting game had officially begun. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered later that night. A loud, aggressive pounding echoed from the front porch. Sarah opened the door to find Mark leaning heavily against the wooden frame, reeking of cheap beer and stale cigarette smoke. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused. "I need to come in," he slurred, trying to push past her. "Tiffany kicked me out. She said I'm broke. I'm coming back home, Sarah." Then his hazy eyes focused on Sarah's new haircut and radiant appearance. He blinked, stunned by how breathtakingly beautiful she looked. "Wow, you look different," he stammered, reaching a dirty hand toward her face. Sarah slapped his hand away with the force of a coiled spring. "Do not touch me," she hissed, her voice radiating absolute authority. "You don't live here anymore. You gave up that right the day you walked out with your suitcase. Now get off my porch before I call the sheriff." Mark stumbled backward, shocked by the venom in her voice. He tried to argue, claiming he was legally entitled to the property, but Sarah simply slammed the heavy oak door directly in his face, locking the deadbolt with a satisfying, metallic click. She leaned against the door, her heart racing, feeling incredibly powerful. The following week, the weather turned cold and grey. The children were at school, and Eleanor was taking a nap. Sarah decided to tackle the dusty, cluttered top shelf of the hallway closet, a space she hadn't touched since they moved in. As she reached into the dark corner, her fingers brushed against a large, heavy leather portfolio. Her breath hitched in her throat. She pulled it down, laying it carefully on the dining room table. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she untied the warm black ribbons. Inside were dozens of charcoal sketches and watercolour paintings. They were her creations from her time in the foster care system. The images were raw, visceral, and hauntingly beautiful. A lonely child sitting in the rain, a broken bird with a fractured wing, a dark, twisting forest with no exit. As she stared at the artwork, a wave of repressed trauma crashed over her. She could smell the institutional bleach of the orphanage. She could hear the cold, dismissive voices of the social workers. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, dripping onto the yellowed paper. The emotional pain was so intense, it felt like a physical weight crushing her chest. She hadn't picked up a brush since the day she met Mark. Eleanor, woken by the sound of muffled sobbing, walked slowly into the dining room. She saw Sarah collapsed over the table, clutching a drawing of a crying cat hiding beneath a crumpled autumn leaf. Eleanor approached quietly, placing a warm, comforting hand on Sarah's shaking shoulder. She looked down at the artwork scattered across the wood, her breath caught in her throat. "Sarah, did you draw these?" Eleanor asked, her voice filled with absolute awe. Sarah nodded through her tears, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. "A long time ago, when I had nothing else." Eleanor pulled up a chair and sat intimately close to her. "My dear girl, you have an extraordinary God-given gift. This isn't just a hobby. This is raw, unfiltered genius. These paintings hold a level of emotional depth that professional artists spend their entire lives trying to achieve." Eleanor looked deeply into Sarah's tear-filled eyes. "Why did you stop? Why would you bury something so incredibly beautiful?" Sarah looked away, her voice cracking. "Because survival took all my energy. Mark told me it was a childish waste of time." Eleanor's eyes hardened with fierce maternal protectiveness. "Mark was a fool. You must paint again, Sarah. You must." The very next day, Sarah took a portion of her hard-earned grocery budget and drove to the small art supply store in town. She felt a strange, thrilling electric current pulsing through her veins. She bought 3 large blank canvases, a set of vibrant acrylic paints, and a handful of professional brushes. When she returned home, she set up a makeshift studio in the corner of the living room by the large bay window. As she squeezed the first dollop of deep cerulean blue onto her wooden palette, the smell of the wet acrylic hit her senses. It was the scent of absolute freedom. She picked up a brush, her hand trembling slightly. She closed her eyes, took a deep, grounding breath, and touched the bristles to the crisp white canvas. The moment the colour struck the fabric, 10 years of suppressed emotion violently exploded out of her. She painted with a feverish, almost frantic intensity. She didn't think. She just let her soul bleed onto the canvas. Hours slipped by like seconds. She forgot to eat. She forgot the time. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, she had created a breathtaking, swirling masterpiece of chaotic, vibrant colours that perfectly captured the feeling of a storm finally breaking. A month passed in a blur of vivid colours and newfound peace. It was the evening of the town's annual autumn festival. The streets were lined with bright lights, food stalls, and local musicians. Sarah had decided to stay home, desperate to finish a complex portrait she had been working on, while Eleanor took the children to the festival to meet up with Chloe and Deputy Liam. The house was blissfully quiet. Sarah was lost in a trance, blending shadows on her canvas when she heard the distinct crunch of heavy tyres on the gravel driveway. She wiped her paint-stained hands on her apron and peered through the living room curtains. A sleek, incredibly expensive black SUV had pulled up in front of the house, a vehicle that looked wildly out of place in their run-down neighbourhood. Deputy Liam stepped out of the driver's side, but it was the man who stepped out of the passenger side that caught Sarah's attention. He was tall, powerfully built, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that screamed old money and city wealth. His face was sharp, handsome, but deeply etched with lines of profound exhaustion and unimaginable stress. Sarah's heart began to race. She knew instantly, instinctively, why this man was here. Just as the stranger walked up the porch steps, the sound of laughing children echoed down the street. Eleanor and the kids were returning from the festival. Eleanor was holding a candied apple, smiling brightly as Noah told a joke. The tall man on the porch turned around at the sound of the voices. He froze. His expensive leather briefcase slipped from his hand, hitting the wooden planks with a loud thud. Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks. The candied apple fell from her fingers, rolling into the dirt. For a terrifying, suspended moment, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. The man let out a choked, desperate sob. "Mom!" he whispered, his voice cracking violently. Eleanor stared at him, her eyes wide, as a massive wave of sudden, violent recognition crashed through her shattered memory. "Julian!" she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Julian sprinted off the porch, falling to his knees in the dirt and burying his face in his mother's coat, weeping with the loud, unrestrained agony of a child. Eleanor collapsed to the ground with him, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders, crying hysterically. Sarah stood in the open doorway, silent tears streaming down her own face as she witnessed the miracle. Later that evening, the children were asleep and the adults sat around the worn dining table. Julian, holding a mug of hot coffee with shaking hands, finally explained the horrific nightmare that had brought them all here. Julian was a highly successful real estate CEO based in Chicago. A year ago, he had married Victoria, a woman who seemed perfect on paper but was secretly driven by dark, insatiable greed. Victoria discovered that my mother's estate was tied up in a trust that I wouldn't inherit fully until my mother passed away, Julian explained, his voice thick with cold, simmering rage. While I was in Europe closing a massive corporate deal, Victoria confronted my mother. They argued. Victoria struck her in the head with a heavy bronze statue, drove her across state lines in the middle of the night, and dumped her on a desolate country road, leaving her for dead. The room fell dead silent. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. When I returned and found my mother missing, I tore the city apart, Julian continued. I hired private investigators, offered massive rewards. Victoria finally confessed to the police when they found my mother's blood in the trunk of her car. She's in prison now, but I had lost all hope of ever finding you alive, Mom. The profound gravity of the situation hung heavily in the air. Julian looked across the table at Sarah, his intense dark eyes filled with a gratitude so deep it was almost painful to witness. Officer Liam told me everything, Julian said softly. He told me how you found her bleeding by the fence, how you took her in, fed her, and cared for her when you barely had enough money to feed your own children. You saved my mother's life, Sarah. I don't know how I could ever possibly repay a debt of this magnitude. Before Sarah could respond, the bedroom door creaked open. Little Mia padded into the room, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She walked directly up to the intimidating, wealthy businessman from Chicago. Without a word, Mia held out her favourite, worn-out stuffed bunny and pushed it into Julian's large hands. You can have Mr. Fluffles, Mia said seriously, her lower lip trembling. Just please don't take our grandma away forever. Ike, Julian, a man used to ruthless corporate boardrooms, completely broke down. Tears spilled from his eyes as he gently accepted the toy, overwhelmed by the pure, unselfish innocence of the child. I promise you, sweetheart, he whispered, his voice breaking. We are all family now. The following night was Julian and Eleanor's last evening in the house. Julian had arranged for a private medical transport to take his mother back to Chicago the next morning for a full neurological evaluation. Sarah stepped out onto the back porch to escape the bittersweet atmosphere inside. The autumn air was biting, smelling of wood smoke and dried leaves. A moment later, the heavy wooden door creaked, and Julian stepped out holding 2 mugs of steaming tea. He handed one to Sarah, their fingers brushing briefly. An electric spark jolted up Sarah's arm. I've arranged a significant financial transfer into your bank account, Julian said quietly, leaning against the wooden railing. It's enough to pay off your mortgage entirely and put all 3 kids through college. Sarah stiffened, stepping back. Julian, I can't accept that. I didn't help your mother for a reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I won't take your money. Julian looked at her, his expression softening into a look of profound, overwhelming admiration. He stepped closer, his imposing presence suddenly feeling incredibly warm and protective. I know you didn't do it for money, Sarah. That's exactly why you deserve the world. You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met. The morning of the departure was heartbreaking. The massive black SUV sat idling in the driveway. Eleanor hugged Noah, Leo and Mia, kissing their cheeks while promising to visit them constantly. When she reached Sarah, the older woman broke down in tears, holding her tightly. You saved my life, my beautiful girl, Eleanor whispered fiercely in her ear. Do not stop painting. Promise me. Julian stood by the car door. He walked up to Sarah, his dark eyes searching her face. He didn't offer his hand for a polite shake. Instead, he pulled her into a deep, lingering embrace that made Sarah's heart pound wildly against her ribs. This isn't goodbye, Julian murmured into her hair, his breath warm against her neck. I will be back, Sarah. I swear it. As the SUV slowly rolled out of the driveway, kicking up a cloud of grey dust, Sarah felt a profound hollow ache in her chest. The house, once chaotic and full of life, suddenly felt overwhelmingly empty. To cope with the silence and the strange, sharp pain of missing Julian, Sarah retreated to her canvas. She painted furiously, pouring all her sorrow, her hidden love, and her desperate hope into explosive, passionate strokes of oil and acrylic. A full year passed. The leaves had turned orange and fallen once again. It was the day of Chloe and Liam's wedding, held at a beautiful rustic barn venue on the outskirts of town. Sarah, looking absolutely radiant in an emerald green bridesmaid dress, was busy organising the chaotic reception. Eleanor had kept her promise, visiting frequently and bringing Julian with her. Over the year, Sarah and Julian had grown incredibly close. The undeniable chemistry between them had blossomed into a deep, profound romance. Julian had quietly become a father figure to the boys, teaching Noah how to throw a football and reading to Mia. But tonight, Julian was stuck in Chicago, closing a massive merger, and Sarah felt his absence acutely. She stepped out into the cool evening air to catch her breath away from the loud music. As she walked toward her parked car to grab a sweater, a dark figure stepped out from behind a large oak tree. It was Mark. He looked worse than ever, unshaven, desperate, and reeking of alcohol. "You think you're better than me now?" Mark snarled, his eyes wild with drunken rage. "Walking around in fancy dresses while I live in a miserable trailer. You owe me, Sarah." Mark lunged forward with terrifying speed, grabbing Sarah forcefully by the shoulders and slamming her hard against the side of her car. The cold metal bit into her back, and she cried out in pain. "You ruined my life!" Mark screamed, spit flying from his lips. Sarah fought back, kicking and shoving, but his drunken adrenaline made him incredibly strong. Suddenly, a massive hand clamped down on the back of Mark's dirty collar. Before Mark could even react, he was violently ripped away from Sarah and thrown to the gravel parking lot with bone-crushing force. Sarah gasped, sliding down the side of the car. Standing over Mark, his fists clenched and his eyes blazing with absolute murderous fury, was Julian. He had driven 4 hours straight from Chicago just to surprise her at the wedding. Julian grabbed Mark by the lapels of his jacket, hauling him off the ground. "If you ever come within 100 yards of this woman or her children again," Julian growled, his voice a lethal, terrifying whisper, "I will bury you so deep nobody will ever find you. Do you understand me?" Mark, terrified and bleeding from a split lip, nodded frantically. Julian threw him to the ground, turned and pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her as she shook. Later that night, after Liam had officially arrested Mark for the assault, Julian drove Sarah home. The house was quiet, the children staying overnight with the babysitter. Julian carried Sarah's heels as they walked into the living room. He switched on the lamp, and his breath caught in his throat. He had never seen her makeshift studio. Dozens of massive, breathtaking canvases were leaning against the walls. The paintings were masterpieces, vibrant, emotional, explosive expressions of pain, rebirth, and profound love. Julian walked slowly among them, completely mesmerized. He stopped in front of a stunning portrait of a dark, brooding man standing in the rain. It was him. "Sarah," Julian whispered, turning to face her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. These are spectacular. You are a genius." Sarah blushed, looking down at her hands. "They're just my feelings," she murmured. Julian closed the distance between them, gently cupping her face in his warm hands. "Your feelings belong in a museum," he said softly. He leaned down and kissed her, a deep, passionate, life-altering kiss that erased every terrible memory of her past. In that moment, Sarah finally realized she had found her true home. 3 months later, the cold Chicago wind whipped through the city streets. Julian guided Sarah, who was blindfolded, out of the back of a luxury town car. Noah, Leo, Mia and Eleanor were following closely behind, giggling in anticipation. "Julian, what is going on?" Sarah laughed, feeling the crisp city air on her face. "Just walk with me," Julian replied softly, his arm securely around her waist. They stepped into a warm, quiet building. "Okay, take it off," he whispered. Sarah pulled the blindfold away and gasped. She was standing in the center of an elite, upscale art gallery in downtown Chicago. The walls were lined with her paintings, brilliantly illuminated by professional spotlights. A massive banner near the entrance read, "The Rebirth of Light," a solo exhibition by Sarah. The gallery was packed with wealthy art collectors, critics and journalists, all sipping champagne and murmuring in awe at her work. Sarah turned to Julian, tears of pure joy streaming down her face. "You did this?" she choked out, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his gesture. Julian smiled, kissing her forehead. "I just provided the walls, my love. You provided the magic. It's time the world saw how incredibly beautiful your soul really is." The exhibition was an absolute resounding triumph. Within the first 2 hours, nearly every single painting had a red sold sticker placed next to it. Critics were clamoring to interview the elusive, brilliant new artist from Indiana. Sarah stood in the center of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, surrounded by the family she had built from scratch. Eleanor was proudly holding little Mia, while Noah and Leo were animatedly describing the paintings to a wealthy art collector. Julian stood off to the side, watching Sarah with a look of pure, unadulterated devotion. Sarah walked over to him, slipping her hand into his. The chaotic noise of the gallery seemed to fade away into a quiet, intimate hum. "Julian," Sarah whispered, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I have something to tell you, something important." Julian looked down at her, his brow furrowing slightly with concern. "What is it, sweetheart? Is everything okay?" Sarah took a deep, shaky breath, her eyes locking onto his. A brilliant, radiant smile broke across her face. "Everything is absolutely perfect," she whispered softly, placing his large hand gently against her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." For a long, suspended moment, Julian simply stared at her, his brain struggling to process the monumental news. The sounds of the gallery completely disappeared. He looked down at his hand resting on her stomach, then back up to her shining eyes. Slowly, a look of profound, earth-shattering joy spread across his handsome face. He let out a breathless, ecstatic laugh, tears immediately welling up in his dark eyes. Without caring about the wealthy critics or the flashing cameras, Julian wrapped his arms around Sarah's waist, lifting her entirely off the marble floor and spinning her around in a dizzying circle of pure happiness. "A baby!" he choked out, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Sarah, my God! You've made me the happiest man alive." The children and Eleanor rushed over, engulfing them in a massive, joyous family hug. Sarah buried her face in Julian's shoulder, surrounded by the vibrant colours of her own triumphant artwork. The dark, terrifying days of unpaid bills, shredded winter jackets, and abusive ex-husbands felt like a completely different lifetime. She had fought through the darkest storms, and finally, she was standing directly in the warm, beautiful sunlight of her perfect new life. Sarah's incredible journey proves that the deepest pain can often be the catalyst for our greatest triumphs. From a desperate, abandoned mother standing in the ruins of her marriage, she blossomed into a celebrated artist, surrounded by a family bound not just by blood, but by profound love and fierce loyalty. The homeless stranger she saved in the dead of night became the very key to unlocking a future more beautiful than she could have ever dreamed. Thank you so much for watching this emotional story to the very end. If Sarah's resilience and Julian's devotion touched your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring cinematic stories, and don't forget to ring the notification bell. We want to hear from you. If you found a stranger in need, would you risk everything to help them like Sarah did? Leave your thoughts and answers in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.